My name is Dave Nave. Russell Ackoff brought new insights into managing the interactions between the parts of a company rather than managing the behavior of each part individually. He called this approach systems thinking, and his insights are a tremendous contribution to business and society. On behalf of the Deming Cooperative, we are pleased to make these videos available to you for your continued learning.
And we said there has to be another way of looking at the problem. Now we happen to know something which suddenly became important. That was the way the salesmen were compensated. They were paid a flat salary plus a commission. And the commission was a percent, a fixed percent of the dollar value of a sale. It didn't make one damn bit of difference to the salesman whether it was a profitable sale or an unprofitable sale. So we designed a different compensation system. The same fixed salary, but now a percentage of the profit of a sale, which meant that if they sold any one of the products that were unprofitable, they got no commission. But we set the commission on the profitable products high enough so that the following condition pertained. If next year they sold exactly what they sold last year, they would earn exactly the same amount of money. But if they sold less unprofitable products, make no difference. But if they sold more profitable products, their income would go up. Well, when we worked all that out, we took it back to the production manager and showed it to him. And after he blew his stop, he said, you know, he said, I don't control compensation for salesmen. That's the personnel and human resources people. You can go talk to them. They don't try to run production, he said. So off we went to the vice president of personnel. We showed him the system, and he looked at it. He said, you know, that's kind of cute. He said, the United States is divided into 5 regions. The Northwest consists of Washington, Oregon, North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, and Montana. Let's use this system for 6 months up there and see what happens. And then we'll decide whether to make it national. Well, we couldn't have asked for anything better. And that 6 months, 65% of the products in the product line were not sold. Sales of the profitable products went up by 18.5%. Corporate profit from that region doubled. Salesman income went up 2.25 times. And the improvement in production from one region was 4.5 times what you would get with perfect scheduling and an errorless forecast. What kind of a problem was it? Was it a production scheduling problem, a product line design problem, or a salesman compensation problem? None of them. These are simply different ways of looking at the problem. And the problem then is, which of the ways is the best? And you can't know that until you look at a problem from a multiplicity of different ways. But the current structure of corporations is always vertical slices with virtually no communication across, and so you tend to solve problems where they appear. There's a classic case, a wonderful one, that occurred in New York at the end of World War II, of an old office building whose tenants began to complain about poor elevator service. They called in engineers to help them, and they discovered that the average waiting time for an elevator was 2 minutes, that the standard in the United States is 20 seconds, so this was 6 times greater than the standard. The engineer said the only thing they could do is either add elevators, replace the existing elevators by faster ones, or use computer controls on the elevators so you get higher utilization of them. They were given a contract to study these possibilities, came back a couple months later, and said none of them would work. They could get waiting time down to 1 minute, but that was still 3 times too long. It was an old building, they said, and you got an unsolvable problem. So they left management with the problem, and the complaints from tenants continued. So out of desperation, the manager did something he would never ordinarily do. He decided to consult his subordinates. So he called a meeting of the 8 department heads that ran the building. They were all there except one. The personnel director was off on a trip. He had a one-man department, and the one man was a young fellow who just graduated in personnel psychology from Penn State University. He came in his boss's place. The boss explained the problem to the group of 8 and said, we're going to do brainstorming. I don't know how familiar you are with brainstorming. It's a simple idea. Here's a problem. What do you think will solve it? Now, he makes this proposal. You don't like it, but you can't say that. You must improve what he said. You're not allowed to say what's wrong with it. If you think something's wrong, fix it. Now, the idea is that cumulatively you get better and better until you reach a point where everybody agrees you got a good solution. That's theory. It never works in practice. You can imagine what happened. He makes this suggestion, and all the rest of you will tell him what's wrong with it. Then if you're silly enough to make the next suggestion, they'll do the same thing to you. And after a little bit, people just shut up. You know, you don't want to be made a fool of. And that's what happened. There was a long silence in the group, and the executive was frustrated. He looked around the room and centered on this young boy. He said, you're the only one that hasn't said anything. Don't you have any ideas, he said. And the young boy kind of blushed. He said, well, as a matter of fact, I do, but I hesitate to propose it because everybody jumps on you. The manager said, forget about that. What's your idea? And the young boy told him. And within 2 weeks, at a cost of $500, the problem was solved. Now, what had he done? See, everybody looked at it as an elevator problem. How do you make the elevators faster so that you don't have to wait as long? But that's not what he looked at it. He said, they have to wait 2 minutes? That's a very short time. Why are they complaining? Well, the answer is obvious. They're bored. Therefore, he said, the problem is to give them something to do that will occupy their time while they're waiting. And so he said, why don't you put mirrors up in the lobby so they can spend their time looking at each other without appearing to do so? That's exactly what they did. 2 things happened. The tenants of the building immediately congratulated the manager on the improvement of the elevator service. And that became a standard in the United States. You go to any tall building in the United States, you'll find mirrors in the elevator lobbies, and on tall buildings, mirrors inside the elevator. So that if you're going up to the 92nd floor, you can spend all your time looking at the pretty girls without appearing to do so. And they can look at the pretty boys. All because somebody looked at the problem differently. So the moral of this is, forget about disciplines. Forget about thinking that the various functional groups in the company define different problems. They don't. There's no such thing as a marketing problem, a production problem, and so on. Now, the next thing we want to look at, similarly, is a misconception. It turns out that there are 4 different ways of treating a problem once you've identified it. You know at least 2 of them. You may know 3, but you certainly don't know all 4. So let's see what they are. First, one thing you do with a problem is ignore it and hope it will solve itself and go away. Now, if you're a parent, you're used to this. Because when you know the kids are fighting, you say, let them alone, they'll work it out. Right? We had a president of the United States for whom this was the self-conscious strategy. Eisenhower. You see, when Eisenhower became president, things were pretty good. And he said, let well enough alone. Don't rock the boat. Let nature take its course. Intervene as little as you possibly can, and then when you intervene, do as little as you possibly can, so as to leave things alone. That's absolution, or management by absolving yourself of responsibility. It doesn't work in a dynamic environment when things are changing. You can't fly through a hurricane on a fixed pilot. So the normal way we deal with most problems is called problem resolution. It's based on experience, qualitative judgment, common sense, and just think about it. What you do is you say, did I ever have a problem like this before? What did I do the last time? Will it work now? If not, how do I adjust it? It's that kind of thinking which leads you to a modification, usually, of something you did before to handle this problem so that you get a result that's better than doing nothing. That's called satisficing. You're not looking for the best possible solution, but something which is better than doing nothing. Now, there's an alternative way of resolving a problem. I have a problem today I didn't have a month ago. What happened? Well, he did something that screwed up things. He's to blame. Now, if I remove him, I'll be back to where I was before the problem arose. That's resolving a problem also. Find the source of blame and remove it. Now, resolution is the way management handles 90% of its problems. And until World War II, it didn't have an alternative. But in England, an alternative was developed beginning in 1938. When the German air invasion began in England, the so-called Battle of Britain, the British had no effective defense against the bombing attacks of the Germans. They did have a new technology called anti-aircraft, which they did not know how to use effectively because it was brand new. So they did a sensible thing. They asked a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, P.M.S. Blackett, to organize a group of scientists to see if they could figure out how to make anti-aircraft fire more effective. He did a kind of an unusual thing. He organized a group of 6 scientists, all from different disciplines. He had a geographer, a geometer, a psychologist, an economist, and so on. This group was called Blackett's Circus, and they went to work. In several months, they came up with a proposed use of anti-aircraft that was completely new. Out of desperation, the British applied it, and it increased the effectiveness by 300%. So the British were tickled pink. He said, "This is a good thing." So they now organized a group of 5 to 8 scientists in different disciplines because Blackett had done it, and said, we're going to put them around the military to help management. The question, where do we put them? Well, the British military, like the American, is divided into administration, intelligence, operations, and logistics. They said the best place to put them is where the military contacts the enemy. That's operations. So they put groups of scientists in the operations divisions to assist management in making operational decisions. And so it got to be called operational research. By the end of the war, the U.S., through its liaison officers, had picked it up, and all 3 of our services were using operational research. At the end of the war, the British published a book on the success of the Allies that attributed it to 3 technologies: radar, sonar, and operational research. In the United States, where it was also kept secret, at the end of the war, Ellis Johnson, a professor at Johns Hopkins, who was in charge of the Army Operational Research Group, published an article in the Sunday supplement to your newspaper called America's Secret Weapon, which was operational research. Immediately, this stuff spread throughout the country. All the universities began to teach it, and we had a new way of dealing with problems, scientifically. So management science emerged to solve problems. It was quantitative, experimental, not commonsensical. And it didn't seek to do better, it seeked to do as well as possible, to optimize. And the so-called theory of optimization developed. And so a whole batch of scientific tools emerged: linear programming, game theory, sequencing theory, scheduling theory, and these spread throughout the professions and became commonplace in engineering and economics and so on. Now, an interesting question emerges. It's the best you can do is to solve a problem. Can you do better than the best? Well, offhand, that looks like a stupid question. How can you do better than the best? But you can, for 2 reasons. The first is, the best stays the best only as long as the environment doesn't change. But you see, if it's pouring rain outside, the best thing I can do is wear a raincoat and carry an umbrella and put on leather boots or shoes. I go out in the rain and suddenly it stops and the sun comes out and it's hot as hell. My solution to the rain problem is no longer a solution. The environment's changed. So the best solution to problems is modified by changes in the environment. That's one problem. The second one is this. Every problem that Galileo faced in physics has been solved. But physics hasn't disappeared. Why not? Because every time a problem is solved, we create new problems. There are more new problems than there were old ones, and they're harder to solve. And the progress of science is just as much the progress of problems as it is the progress of solutions. So the question is this: is there a way of treating a problem so that it's independent of changes in the environment and which will not create new problems that are more difficult than the old one that you solved? And the answer is yes, there is. And what it requires is a redesign of the system that has the problem so that the problem cannot arise again. It's the elimination of the possibility of a problem through redesign. That's not analysis. Design is putting things together. It's synthetic thinking. So the method of science is the epitome of the development of analytical thinking. But the method of synthetic thinking is design. I'll come back to that in a moment. But let me just give you, since time is short, a very simple, the simplest case I know of, where a problem was eliminated by redesign. Most of you are old enough to remember the times when almost everybody smoked. You smoked cigarettes, and some of you probably still do. When you buy a package of cigarettes, or bought a package of cigarettes, you always got a paper book of matches. Remember those matches? There's a paper fold over with a bunch of paper matches inside. The largest, the largest producer of those was the Ohio Match Company. They were in the courts all the time being sued. Why? People would take the book of matches and not close it, strike a match, and a spark would come off the end of the match, hit the other matches, and it would explode and burn the hand that held it. And they'd take the company to court, and they'd always win the case. And they'd have several hundred cases a year. So they consulted their lawyers, which was the first stupid thing they did. And the lawyer said, print at the bottom, close cover before striking, and this will absolve you of responsibility. Well, that was nonsense, because people didn't read what it said. It was too small, and they didn't care if they read it. And they continued to strike the match with the book of matches open and burn their hands and take the company to court. One day, a young man came into the corporate headquarters in Ohio, saw the receptionist, and said, I want to see the CEO. He's about an 18-year-old, and she said, what do you want to see him for? He says, I got a solution to your burn hand problem that won't cost the company anything. She said, you do? What is it? Oh, no. He said, I want to show it to the CEO. So she got the CEO on the phone and explained, and he was curious. He said, send the young man up. The young man went up and showed into his office. After the amenities, the CEO said to the young man, what's your solution to the burn hand problem? The young man said, how much is it worth? He said, what do you mean, how much is it worth? He said, I'm not going to tell you what it is until you tell me how much it's worth. The CEO said, how can I tell you how much it's worth until I know what it is? So there they were in an enigma. That they solved by calling lawyers. They negotiated a contract in that room at that time, which said that if he could tell them how to eliminate the problem at no cost to the company would pay that young kid $40,000. When the contract was signed, at the table, the young man said what you all know. What did he say? Take the abrasive off the front and put it on the back of the package of matches. He redesigned the package, and now you cannot burn your hand. Because if a spark comes off of matches that you strike, It cannot go around the book of matches and hit the other match. Design becomes the mode of operation of a systems thinker. He tries to solve problems by redesigning the system that has it so as to eliminate the possibility of the problem. But we have learned a tremendous amount about design. It's the most powerful tool available to management. And I want to show you who it was that discovered this and how it was done, because I happen to be lucky enough to be there by sheer coincidence. It was done at Bell Telephone Laboratories in 1951 by a vice president who was in charge of the laboratories. In 1951, I was on the faculty of Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland. And like all institutes of technology, we were visited regularly by representatives of high-tech companies who would try to hire our best graduate students long before the end of the semester. And among those companies was AT&T. AT&T's representative was a young man from Bell Labs, Peter Myers, who was a graduate of Oxford University in England with a PhD in physics. He was a Rhodes Scholar, an American who had gone to England. We became good friends. It turned out he had just married about the same time I had, and so he would arrange to come to Case for his visits on a Friday or Monday with his wife and spend the weekend with me and my wife. We had a project in England, in New York, and we would arrange, my wife and I, to go there on a Friday or Monday and spend the weekend with him and his wife in Hackettstown, New Jersey, where he lived. We started to do some work together. So one week, when I had to be in New York on Thursday for a project we're working on with Union Carbide, I called him at the beginning of the week and said, I got to be in New York on Thursday. I've got an open Wednesday. Can I come to the labs and we could work together? He checked his schedule. He said, it's open. Come on in. I said, okay, I'll be in there Wednesday morning. Turned out that on Tuesday, I got a telephone call from Union Carbide. There was a crisis on the project. Come in immediately. Don't wait till Thursday. So I ran home, grabbed some clothes, packed them up, and went to New York, got there late in the afternoon. And we worked late in the night on the problem. They then found a hotel room for me, which I took nearby, and arranged for a rental car to be available the next morning so I could drive to Murray Hill, New Jersey, where Bell Labs was. About a 30-minute ride. I got there at 8:45 before Peter arrived. And when he arrived, he was very angry. I'd never seen him angry before. He came in, he didn't say good morning. He came in and said, where the hell were you last night? I said, I was in New York. Why? What's the problem? He said, I know you're in New York. Your office knew you were in New York, but nobody knew where you were in New York. He said, for good reason. Because I didn't know where I was going to be until after 5 o'clock when the offices were closed. And I explained. I said, but what are you mad about? He calmed down. He said, at 4:30 yesterday afternoon, I got a call from the vice president who runs Bell Labs. And he said there will be a meeting this morning at 9 o'clock of all section heads. And I'm a section head. I got to be at that meeting. He told me no excuse for absence would be acceptable. I tried to reach you to tell you not to come. I said, well, unfortunately you couldn't. You better go to the meeting. I got some work. I'll sit here, and if you're not back by noon, I'll go to New York because I have to be there for tomorrow anyhow. He said, well, I knew you'd say that, but I feel guilty. So you better not feel guilty. You better get to that meeting. It's now about 2 minutes to 9. So he started to leave, and he got in the doorway and turned around and said, hey, why don't you come with me? He said, you said it's a meeting of section heads. He said, hell, I'll never know the difference. Come on. I said, yeah, but Pete, suppose they do. Won't you get in trouble? He paused. He said, I'll tell you what. You come with me, but we won't sit together. So if they catch you, I'll pretend not to know you. So what the hell? They can't do anything to me. I'm not employed here. So off we went. We got to a small classroom that held about 40 people. And on the back row, the 2 seats on the aisle were empty. So I took the one on one side and Peter took the one on the other. See, we were separated by an aisle. But we could talk across the aisle because the vice president wasn't there. He was late, and that never had happened before. The vice president was 6'3", 250 pounds, of a back-slapping extrovert. He couldn't get near you without hugging you, pinching you, pushing you, doing something physical. He was cherubic, red cheeks, effusive. He knew everybody's name. He had his nose in everybody's business. He was a great executive, but they hated to spend a lot of time with him because he was overbearing. But they thought he was a good executive. That absence was unusual. It wasn't until 7 or 8 minutes after the hour that you could hear the back door open and look back, and he knew immediately there was a crisis. He was a pasty gray, he was bent over, and he started down the aisle in a slow shuffle. He did not look up and say anything to anybody. Came up to the podium, put his elbows down and held his head, and didn't say a word. The room was dead silent. After what seemed like a very long time, but was only a minute or so, he looked up, and this is exactly what he said. Gentlemen, the telephone system of the United States was destroyed last night. And he looked down. Now the room broke out in a hubbub because we knew damn well it wasn't true. Among others, I had used the phone that morning. So the system couldn't have been destroyed. But more importantly, you can't destroy the telephone system. You'll never guess why. Because it's not a system. It's a network. And there's a major difference between a network and a system. A network has no essential parts. You see, if I take the connection between Los Angeles and San Francisco and cut it out, can I communicate to San Francisco? Of course I can. Go through Bakersfield or go through Sacramento. In a network, there are always alternative ways of connecting any 2 points, but not in a system. There are no essential parts of a network. So what the hell is he talking about? Well, the decision was, since he's the boss, you better get a little more data before you do anything. So the room quieted down. He looked up a second time and he glowered at the group. He said, I know what you were just saying to each other. Some of you probably say you used the phone this morning and the system couldn't have been destroyed last night. Am I right? Now, the room was greatly relieved because this showed he's in touch with reality. So they went like this, yes. And he began to tremble with rage. He got cherry red. It looked like he's going to explode. And he shouted, damn it, I told you. The telephone system in the United States was destroyed last night, and you better believe it. Because if you don't believe it by noon, I'm going to fire you. And he looked down again. Well, now the hubbub really did begin. You know, there's something wrong with this guy. Should we call an ambulance and a psychiatrist or what? Well, when your boss is involved, discretion is the better part of valor. So the room quieted down to get a little more data before anything was done. He now looked up the third time, glowering at the group, and suddenly he straightened up. His normal color came back, and he broke out in a great big belly laugh. It was a trick. Everybody in the room started to laugh. They didn't know why, but they were so relieved that he wasn't off his rocker that everybody laughed. Eventually the room quieted down, and now in his perfectly normal voice he said, what in the world was that all about? He said, I'm going to tell you, but before I do, I'm going to make 2 things absolutely clear. The telephone system of the United States was destroyed last night. And you better believe it. Because you don't believe it by noon, I'm going to fire you. Now why? He said in the last issue of the Scientific American, they report on a study that was done internationally. They came out asserting that the Bell Telephone Laboratories are the best industrially based research and development laboratories in the world. He said, I believe that. Is there anybody in this room who doesn't? And of course, all of them employees of Bell Labs agreed. He said, good. He said, it occurred to me, I ought to make a list of the major contributions we've made to the development of telephonic communication. So he pulled out a sheet of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket that was folded up about the size of an airline envelope, covered with handwriting which we couldn't read. He said, before I reveal my conclusions, I want to get yours. What do you think, he said, are the major contributions we made to the development of telephonic communication? Almost every hand in the room went up. Not me, though. He called on one of the fellows and he said, the dial. He said, right, the dial is certainly one of the most important. When did we introduce the dial? Somebody knew. It was in the 1930s. He said, when did we invent the dial? And nobody knew. He said, that's okay. He said, I didn't know either, but I looked it up before I came to this meeting. And he gave us a date, which much to our surprise was before 1900. He said, all right, let's take another one. The second one I never heard of. Somebody said multiplexing. He said, right. Now later I found out what it is. Multiplexing is a way of sampling sound so you can send 6 telephone conversations across the same wire at the same time. It increased the capacity of AT&T by 600%. He said, right, that's certainly one of the most important. When did we introduce it? It was between the 2 world wars. When did we invent it? Nobody knew. He told us when it had been invented, and it was also before 1900. He said, let's take one more. The third one thrown out was a coaxial cable that connected the United States and Britain. He said, right. He said, you now got the same 3 that I've got. He said, when did we build that cable? And I remember that date, 1882. He said, now, gentlemen, doesn't it strike you as odd that the 3 major contributions to the development of the telephone in this laboratory, we agree, were all made before anybody in this room, including me, were born? What the hell have you been doing? And then he said, I'll tell you what you've been doing. It's wrong, and it's not your fault, it's mine. He said, you've been looking at the parts of the system separately and improving them. But you haven't improved the system one damn bit. Because we think that by improving the parts, you can make the whole better. And that's not true. The first exposure I got to the systems principle. Therefore, gentlemen, he said, the telephone system in the United States was destroyed last night, and we're going to spend the next year designing the system we would replace the existing system with. Right now, if we could replace it with any system we wanted, subject to only 2 minor constraints. He said, now let me explain. I want to know what we would do right now. Why? Most funny to talk about where you want to be 5 or 10 years from now. He said, that's nonsense. Because 5 or 10 years from now, you're certainly not going to want to be where you say you're going to want to be today, because of things that happen between now and then. Furthermore, if you don't know where you want to be right now, how the hell can you know where you want to be 5 or 10 years from now? He said, that's nonsense. Secondly, he said, I want to know where we want to be without constraints. Why? Because if you don't know what you would do if you could do whatever you wanted to, how can you know what to do when you can't do whatever you want to? So, gentlemen, we're going to design a new telephone system for the United States, starting from scratch, with the only 2 constraints being, first, the system must be technologically feasible. I don't want any science fiction. We can only use what we currently know. And then he used some wonderful examples. He said, we cannot use mental telepathy because we don't know how to connect people at random. He said, but we can use satellites, which we don't have yet. This is 1951. Because we're working on them and we know we can have them. We spent an hour discussing this until the group had internalized the meaning of technological feasibility. And then he said, the system we design must be operationally viable. He said that means that the system we design must be able to survive in the current environment, because we're not changing the environment. It does not have to be capable of being implemented. But if it were implemented, it would survive. Now, what does that mean? He said, we're not changing the law, it has to obey the law. So a public corporation will have shareholders, and therefore will be subject to regulation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. And he went on through a list of requirements to be survivable in the current environment. Now, all this discussion got us to about 11:30 in the morning. He said, now this group is too big to work on this as a single group. So I'm going to divide you up into 6 groups and give each group a subsystem. Each subsystem can do whatever it wants to do, providing it doesn't affect any other subsystem. That unfortunately, almost everything that any group does will affect other systems. Therefore, each group will pick a representative, and they will meet each week to discuss what their group is doing, to get the approval or disapproval of other groups that are affected by what each group is doing. He said at the end of the year, I want to see one integrated design of the whole. I don't want to know what the 6 groups did, but I want a design to which all agree. Now, we spent about 20 minutes discussing that. It got us to about 10 and 12. He looked at the clock and he said, I want to break for lunch and end this meeting. So I'm going to use the latest developments in organization theory to pick the 6 groups. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, he said. You're the long line team. Now, long line in telephone language means between city communication. The next 6 were the short line team, within city communication. The next 6 were the switching stations. And he got around and he ended the 5th group immediately beside me. And then he said, the rest of you, which included Peter Myers on the other side of the aisle, and me, will redesign a telephone set. So there I was on a team, and I was on a team with my friend Peter Myers. The meeting was adjourned, so the team immediately got together to get to know each other. And when Peter introduced me to the other members of the team, all of whom were employees of Bell Labs, they laughed. They thought this was funny. They referred to me as a ringer from the outside. And they invited me to participate, which was unfortunate, because I spent most of the next year at Bell Labs, not at Case, where I was employed, working with them, because what a year it was. I want to give you a feeling for what happened. At 1:30 that afternoon, we met for the first time in a small breakout room with a table. There were 7 of us, 6 from Bell Labs and me. There was a little table on the side with a telephone set sitting on it, an easel and a pad. That's all there was in the room. We said, where do we begin? And one of the members of the group said, why don't we make a list of all the things that are wrong with the telephone, and then see if we can design a telephone that doesn't have those faults. Somebody else said, that's a lousy way of doing it. And we were a little shocked. You know why? That sounds perfectly reasonable. And then he taught us a lesson. He said, when you get rid of what you don't want, you do not necessarily get what you do want. He said, and you're talking about getting rid of what we don't want. And then he used a very simple example. He said, suppose you walk into a room, there's a television set, you turn it on. Some channel will come up. What's the probability that that channel will be one you want to watch? He said, I've calculated that. It's about 1 in 100. Now, I can get rid of it very easily because I don't want it. All I have to do is turn the channel. What's the probability I'll get something I want? It's still 1 in 100. In fact, I have a 50-50 chance of getting a program I want less than the original program. And you've all had that experience working with television. He said, effective management must be directed at what you want, not against what you don't want. Now, that really sounds simple-minded, doesn't it? But I'm willing to give any one of you even odds that if you take the meetings of your executives to make decisions, at least 50% of their decisions are deciding what they don't want, not deciding what they do. It's just natural to us. So he said, okay, let's make a list of what we want the telephone to do. One person got up at the easel and pad and started to write. The first thing thrown out was, every phone call I receive is intended for me. Now, in normal language, that means no wrong numbers, but it's more than that. It's not only no wrong numbers, but the call is for me, not somebody else at that number. We all agreed that would be ideal. I made the second suggestion, which was, of course, great. I want to know who's calling me before I answer the phone. So if I don't want to talk to them, I don't pick up the phone. Now, everybody agreed. The third suggestion was, I want a phone I can use without hands. Great. Fourth suggestion was really great. I did not make it, unfortunately. One of the members of the group said, I am tired of going to the telephone when it rings. I want the phone to come to me wherever I am. We all agree that's a wonderful idea. Now we got warmed up. For 3 weeks, we kept listing properties we want the telephone to have, and we wound up with 92 properties before we ran dry. Boy, the last one was a Lulu. I remember it clearly. I want to be able to lecture to 10 groups in 10 different cities, and on a screen to see each of the 10 groups. And if you're in one of the groups and you got a question, I want to see you full face when you ask the question. I want you to see me full face. If I want to transmit to you a table or a chart, I want to be able instantaneously to deliver to you the same piece of paper I have in my hand. If I write on a blackboard or a pad, I want it to appear immediately on a blackboard or a pad in your room in those 10 locations. A very complex audio-visual system based on the use of the telephone. We ran dry. So he said, what do we do now? We haven't designed a damn thing. All we've done is list properties we want. So somebody said, why don't we take the first property on the list? Every call you receive is intended for you. And see if we can design a telephone that has that property. Now, at this point, I made a terrible decision. I pointed out to them something I knew because I taught a course in logic. There are two kinds of wrong numbers. One is when you have the right number in your head and you dial it incorrectly. The other is when you have the wrong number in your head and dial it correctly. But one of the groups said, yeah, but wait a minute. Suppose I got the wrong number in my head, dial it incorrectly, and get the right number. Well, fortunately, they decided that's very unlikely. So it's important to know what percentage of the wrong numbers are the right number incorrectly dialed or the wrong number correctly dialed. I was able to preserve my status because I knew the head of the psychology department at Bell Labs, Dr. Samuel Carlin, and I got him on the phone and said, Sam, have you ever done work on wrong numbers? And he exploded. I couldn't understand him for the next couple of minutes. It turned out he'd been doing research on wrong numbers for 17 years, and I was the first one to ask him about it. So he wanted to tell me everything he knew. All I wanted to know is what percentage of the wrong numbers are the right number incorrectly dialed or the wrong number correctly dialed. I finally got it. 80% of the wrong numbers is the incorrect dialing of the right number in your head. So we said, okay, that's what we want to take care of first. Now, an absolutely amazing thing happened. We figured out in 30 minutes how to prevent the incorrect dialing of the right number in your head. Now, unfortunately, I don't have something to draw on, but let me describe it in words. We took a desk set of a telephone and took the dial off the telephone. And in its place, we put something that did not exist in 1951, but all of you have now, a hand calculator. So it was a register and 10 buttons, 3 rows of 3, and then 1 row of 1. And then at the bottom, a red button. The way you use this phone, you came to it and did not lift the receiver off the hook. You put your number in by pushing the buttons. The number you put in shows in the register, 7928531. Remember, you got the right number in your head, so you look at that number. Is it right? If it's right, you pick up the receiver and the whole number will go through at once. If it's wrong, you hit that red button, clear the phone, and do it over again. So we were delighted. We had a way of solving the problem. But we didn't know whether it was feasible, because the handheld calculator didn't exist. So we called a department of Bell Labs called micro miniaturization. Asked for technological help, and they sent 2 young kids down that had just graduated from electronics at MIT and were still wearing their intellectual diapers. They came in the room and listened to us for a little while, and then they began to whisper to each other. And pretty soon they were more engaged in their whispered conversation than they were in listening to us. Now that kind of rudeness you're used to in an R&D laboratory, but then they did something which really shocked us. They got up and ran out of the room. No explanation. We were furious. To hell with them. Now we went on and did something else. 3 weeks later, they returned and came in the room sheepish and apologetic. So you probably wondered what happened to us the last time we were here. What happened? We were very excited by what you were doing, but not for the reasons you were. And we didn't want to take the time to tell you, because what excited us was the idea of buttons instead of a dial. So we went back and built a telephone with push buttons. We tested it on 2,000 people. They said, you know, it takes 12 seconds less to put 7 digits into a phone by pushing buttons than by turning a dial. Furthermore, with your design, where you don't pick up the receiver until after the number is in, you save another 8 seconds of using the system's telephone line. Together, that's a 20% increase in the capacity of AT&T. So we have started a project in engineering to develop that telephone. And it's given a code name which is completely secret. And he said, we'll tell you, but you cannot discuss it. They looked around the room to make sure nobody was listening. And he told us the name of the new telephone, Touchstone. That's where the Touchstone telephone came. Every telephone change that's occurred since 1953 came out of that study. Somebody got a mobile telephone here? I left mine in my coat pocket. If you hold it up, that's exactly the telephone we designed. It's got a computer, handheld calculator in the front, right? You put the number in, it shows in the register, but you haven't lifted the receiver. If the number is right, you lift the receiver. How do you do that? You press the green button, right? If it's the wrong thing, what do? You hit the red button, it clears the phone, you do it over again. There it is. That's the phone. We built the first mobile telephone in 1952, but we didn't have satellites. So the first telephone was a radio broadcasting studio, a little tiny one. And the receiving phone was a radio receiver. It had a limited range, but by God, we had a mobile telephone. When the technology became available, of course, it went to this phone. Every change that's occurred to the phone, and some which haven't yet occurred, came out of that study except 2. We did not get photography and the internet in 1951. Those came later. It was the most exciting thing I've ever done in an organization. It created a new future for itself by redesigning itself from scratch in a process called idealized redesign, which is a way of dissolving a problem by redesigning the system so the old problems disappear and you create a new future. How? By showing where you'd like to be ideally now. Now you can look at the gaps between where you want to be and where you are right now. And then planning becomes a process of closing the gap right now. And so you create the future by what you're doing now. The only time you can act is now. And the only effect you can have on the future is now. So the real question of planning is, what can you do now that will produce the future that you want? Not what can you do in the future. And this does that. So let's look at this process for a moment. Design of a system is the best way to acquire knowledge and understanding of the system. I'd like to get rid of that white box, if you can. Ah, good. It's called idealized design, and as I've told you, it assumes that the existing system was destroyed last night, but the environment is untouched. And you design a system with which you would replace the existing system with, you could replace it with anything that you wanted, subject to two constraints. It must be technologically feasible, and it must be operationally viable. Now, one other additional thing that was added subsequent. The Bell telephone system is a mechanical system, but AT&T isn't. AT&T is a social system. And when you build a social system, it has to be able to learn and adapt to changing conditions. And that's the third requirement. Now, if you build one that can learn and adapt rapidly and effectively, then there are some things you can do that you cannot otherwise do. Let's look at it. Let me see. First thing it does is simplify the planning process. How? In normal planning, you stand where you are and plan out to where you want to go. But here, you stand where you want to be and plan backwards to where you are. That sounds nutty, doesn't it? Why in the world do you want to plan backwards? Suppose I want to go from here to San Francisco, and I want to find the shortest route. Well, you all know how to do it. Take a map, mark all the ways I can go from here to San Francisco. Since the map gives you the distance of each leg of each path, you can add them up and find out which is the shortest one, right? That's not the best way to do it. It is much better to work backwards from San Francisco to here and find the shortest route. That doesn't make any sense. Suppose I'm in San Francisco and want to come here. Are you telling me I ought to find the shortest route back from here to San Francisco? Yeah. It doesn't make sense. Why should finding the shortest route depend where I am? The shortest route is the shortest route independently of where I stand. Wrong. Richard Bellman at the University of Southern California in the 1950s discovered it makes a difference where you are when you're looking to find the shortest route, and it's always easier to find it working backwards. Now, let me give you a very simple illustration. You all know the way the Wimbledon tennis tournament works? You mean everybody plays a tennis match, and you gradually eliminate the losers until you wind up with the final match, and one person wins, and one comes in second. Suppose 64 players enter the Wimbledon tennis match. How many matches will have to be played? Well, it's easy, isn't it? In the first round, how many matches will there be if there are 64 players? 32, right? Second round, how many will there be? 16. In the third round, how many? 8. In the fourth round, how many? 4. In the fifth round, 2. And in the sixth round, 1. 32 plus 16 plus 8 plus 4 plus 2 plus 1. I can tell you how much that adds up to. 63. But now, instead of starting at the beginning of the tournament, let me start at the end. If there were 64 players, how many losers did there have to be? No arithmetic. There it is, the answer right there. It's very simple. Now, if you want to see the real advantage, suppose 57 players enter the tournament. Now you got a problem. You can't start with half of 57. What you've got to do is give the highest seeded player a pass on the first round, so that the number of seeded players who are given the pass plus the number of winners in the first round is a power of 2. So you can start to divide in half. That's a little tricky if you work frontwards, but not if I work backwards. If 57 players enter the tournament, how many matches will there have to be? I don't have to know how it's arranged. How many will there have to be? Well, how many losers will there have to be? 56. To be a winner, there must be 56 losers. Working backwards simplifies the process of planning by an order of magnitude. And you won't believe this until you do it. If you want a simple test, find a maze. You know the puzzle called a maze? Work it from the entrance to the exit. And then when you're done, redo it working from the exit to the entrance. And you'll find out it's always easier to solve a maze from the exit to the entrance. The interesting thing is the kids know this. Children learn this very quickly, and they solve mazes by working them backwards. Second thing, it enlarges the concept that the designer has of what is feasible. Let me give you a simple example of this. I had a high school buddy that served during Second World War in England. And while he was stationed in England, he met a British gal, Pamela Hurt, whom he married at the end of the war and settled in London. They live in a big old flat in a 5-story building that has 2 flats per floor, right near the Marble Arch, not far from it, on a little street called Transept Street. Fortunately, they have some extra bedrooms, so that whenever I go to London, I can stay with him. They have a next-door neighbor, which are 2 flats per floor, and they've been living together on that floor for more than 40 years. So that's not a neighbor, that's simply an extended family that covers the 2 flats. I was sitting in the living room with my friends one day when Madge, the housewife living next door on the same floor, came in, and she was hopping mad. She said, "You know what that damn Marks and Spencer's did to me today?" Now, Marks and Spencer's, for those of you that don't know it, is the largest retail chain in the world. They sell, it's like a mini Sears, except no hardware. It's food and clothing primarily. They're in every other corner of England. And they're right around the corner from where they live. For those of you that know London, it's the Marks and Spencer at the corner of Edgware Road and Marylebone. Now, she said, every morning when I go shopping, because in the 60s, housewives had to shop every morning because they did not have refrigeration. That came later. She said, I cash a check to do my shopping at Marks and Spencer's. And they always cash my check. I got there this morning, they told me they've got a new policy. They will no longer cash checks. There she was. They had thrown up an obstruction. She couldn't get what she wanted. They won't cash a check. And then she stopped. She looked at us. She got a little smile on her face. She said, I got them. What'd you do, Madge? She said, I asked myself the following question. Is there any place where this company puts out cash? She said, I could identify one. So I went downstairs, she said, and bought a dress. And I paid for the dress by a check. Then I took the dress to the return department, turned it back in, and got a cash refund. You see, working backwards from where they issued cash, she could figure out a way to do it. But working frontwards, she couldn't. It changes our concept of feasibility. And finally, what this does is it enhances, by a order of magnitude, creativity. One example. There's a major bank in the United States that has its headquarters in New York City, 2,000 employees in its headquarters. They had 3 thefts in the last 6 months that went away with $14 million in negotiable securities. They caught 2 of the groups, got some of the securities back. The third one got away clean. So they organized a study group of executives plus us to increase the security measures in the bank. We had a meeting in the boardroom with all the executives of the bank, and I took along a graduate student because you never can tell when you might need a new idea. So we were sitting there, how can we increase the security? Well, one thing was obvious. We'll put a magnetic marker on every negotiable security, and then put magnetic detectors all around the building so that anywhere you went, you would have to pass a magnetic detector that would set off a signal where there would be an inspector who would demand to see your legitimate right to carry that security. Furthermore, we would put television cameras so that every point in the building was covered in a large control room where there were screens with a number of people watching them so that you could see what was going on at every point in the building. This is what we were working on. In the middle of all this, the graduate student I had with me leaned over the table and looked at the president and said, how do they get this stuff out of the building? He said, what do you mean? It's just paper. Put it in your pocket and walk out. And if you're worried about it, you hide it. And students said, well, why don't you do a body check on them when they leave the building? He said, are you crazy? Do you know how long it would take to do a body check for paper if they knew that you were going to inspect them? You can hide it in the lining of your briefcase, lining of your shoe. You can put it in the lining of your coat. There are all kinds of ways of concealing paper. Furthermore, they're not going to allow you to go through a long inspection looking for paper when you got 2,000 people waiting to get out of the bank. The young boy sat back. He had been sat on. And we went back to the television cameras and the magnetic markers. About 10 minutes later, the young boy jumped up. He said, I got it, like Archimedes. He said, why don't we have everybody in the bank work in the nude? Isn't that a marvelous solution? How can you walk out carrying paper if you're in the nude? Now, of course, it's infeasible. And so what you would normally do is pat the kid on the head and say, hey, that's cute, let's go on. It did not happen. The vice president of operations said, hey, he's got an idea. Of course we can't have people work in the nude. But if we could get them in the nude just when they leave the bank for 1 minute, we could inspect them and make sure they're not carrying paper. And somebody said, are you crazy? If you think you're going to get the people in the bank to undress so you can inspect them for paper, you're nutty, especially the women. Somebody else said, well, what we got to do is find out a way of making sure they're not leaving the bank with paper without looking at them. And then somebody had an idea. They went to Paris. They got Dior, Saint Laurent, and Balmain, each to design a complete set of clothing. They had 3 sets of clothing for every male and every female who worked in the building, including the executives. Then they arranged the entry and exit to the bank differently. You came in and went to a locker room where in privacy you stripped into the nude. Walked through a shower room. You could take a shower or not, it's up to you. In privacy, into another locker room where you put on the uniform. Now the uniforms were beautiful. They were more expensive and better designed than the clothing that most people that worked in the bank could afford. That didn't matter. What mattered is the end of the day. They came into the second locker room and they stripped, taking off the uniform. Cleaning and dry cleaning was all done by the bank during the night when they weren't there. They then went into the shower room in privacy, where there was high-pressure water coming at them from every direction. There was no way of getting paper through that shower room. They then went into another locker room where they dressed and went home, and it stopped theft. Now that system has since been used in a number of different places. The most interesting one is a factory that made pantyhose. Why? The women were robbing that company blind. How? They put on 5 pairs of pantyhose when they left the company at night. And so they're all conducting a black market business. They could get 4 or 5 pairs every night that they worked. And so they had a business on the outside selling pantyhose. But when they had to walk through a shower with water coming at them from every direction, they were unwilling to walk with 5 pairs of wet pantyhose out of the bank. And so theft stopped. All because the constraints on creativity were removed. And some kid said, why don't they all work in the nude? So creativity is enhanced by the process. This has now been used by hundreds of companies on hundreds of problems in different countries, and believe me, it transforms an organization and its view of its possible future. Well, I'm going to stop here. We have a few minutes left, and see if you've got any questions between now and a quarter after. If I'm right, that's about 20 minutes where we can handle any questions that you have. Now, let me explain. Unfortunately, I have a hearing problem. I have a low frequency problem. And on the way here from Mexico, I lost my hearing aid. I have a device which helps a little bit, but I have a better one which helps a lot. If I can't understand you, she's going to translate for me.
Please wait for the microphone.
There is a microphone, but that's not my problem. It's not volume. It's frequency. I lose high frequency. This device will help me a little bit. So go ahead and ask your question or argue with me. I'll dare you. Okay, here's one right here.
What happened to number 3? We got into 1, 2, and then we went on to number 4, and I missed 3. There. You passed over. You got to 2, and then you talked about 4, and you went up to 3, and somehow I missed that.
The 4th step of idealized design.
Solution. Okay. Thank you.
The 4th step.
Yeah. Solution. Okay. Thank you.
You mean dissolution of a
No, I had the solution. I just missed.
What was the question now?
I think we've solved it. We've solved it.
The 4 ways?
4 ways of treating
Yeah, the 4th way
problem
is the next slide. The disillusion.
I got the 4th one. I just didn't get 3.
Ah, okay. Now, by the way, you can change the wording. You know, this is arbitrary. I like to use the STEM solution, and I get absolution, resolution, solution, and dissolution. But that's playing with words. I like to do that. You can call it whatever you want, as long as you got the idea. Okay? Don't be afraid. I won't bite you.
Seeing how you participated with the design of the touch-tone phone, can you tell me why the pattern on a touch-tone phone is just the opposite of what you would see on a keyboard or a calculator?
Why the keyboard on a phone is different?
Why the pattern of numbers is just the opposite?
Because when we designed the telephone, we started from scratch. And we said, how do you read? From left to right. So we said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's why. See, the other keyboard is not designed that way. But we, starting from scratch, could do whatever we thought was the most ease intuitively. And it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. The alphabet the same way, A, B, C, D, E, and so on. The way you read, that's why. We said the other people are stupid, not us. That's a good question. Yeah, he's got one there, but I'll get you the next time.
If I'm a supplier to Rocketdyne and we develop a problem, do you have some ways we could perhaps work together on an idealized design? Because that's not traditionally what we do.
How can a supplier work with Rocketdyne on idealized design? Because that's not what we do now.
Yeah. It's by ignoring the difference between the supplier and the company that supplied, because they're parts of the same system, the supply chain. And what we're beginning to do is redesign the supply chain with all the participants along the way. And you may have 8, 9, 10 of them. You ever look at Dell, for example, the computer company? They don't manufacture a damn thing. They buy all the parts and assemble them. But where do they buy the parts? In 7 different countries. So if they pull together everybody, boy, they got a United Nations, all responsible for making the Dell computer. But they work as a system, and the fact that they're separate companies is irrelevant in deciding how they would organize ideally. You see, that's what the Japanese did when they developed just-in-time delivery system and moved inventories out of the company. It moved it out of the suppliers who knew when to produce and not have to accumulate large inventories for expected subsequent sales. So the trick is to involve all the stakeholders in any idealized redesign, because there's a fundamental principle. Anybody who is affected by a plan who did not participate in it will object to its implementation. There was a study done recently in the United States of public planning. What percentage of public plans do you think are ever completely implemented? 2%? 98% of the plans produced at millions of dollars are never implemented. Why not? For a very simple reason. The people who have to implement it were involved in producing the plan, and they say, the hell with it, I'm not going to support this. And you can always sabotage a plan from down below. Okay, we had a question over here, right there.
What do you believe it will take to change business schools and their approach right now to thinking? Are they going to start switching now or in the future to synthetic rather than analytic thinking and teaching?
Yeah.
What will it take to change business goals in businesses from analytic to synthetic?
It takes 3 things. One is a crisis will do it. A company that's in a state of crisis has tried everything and nothing works will then, out of desperation, even try things that they don't think will work, because what the hell have they got to lose? For example, my father was the least suspicious person I ever knew. He didn't believe in any of the myths about good luck. He would walk under ladders, have a black cat, any of that stuff. He also had arthritis. And I came home one summer from my job in Cleveland, and he was wearing a copper bracelet. I said, "You've never worn jewelry before. Why are you suddenly wearing a copper bracelet?" He said, "Well, it's supposed to be good for arthritis." I said, "Do you believe that?" He said, "No, of course not." And I said, "What are you wearing it for?" He said, "What the hell? I've tried everything else." Companies in that position will make a change out of desperation. I can tell you a number that did. The second case is where somebody in the company, usually a CEO, is excited by the ideas of systems, intellectually. So Jim Reinhardt at Clark Equipment got very excited by these ideas and applied them. Vince Baraba, who was in charge of strategy at GM, did the same thing in a part of GM. So it can be a mind that is interested intellectually in trying it out. The third possibility is somebody less than an executive decides to do it. You see, people ask me all the time, what's the best place to begin this stuff? And the answer is simple, it's wherever you are. But there's no way of eliminating risk by making a fundamental change. So you have to be willing to run a risk by doing something unconventional. But most of the fundamental changes that occur because somebody below the top made a fundamental change. Now I can give you all kinds of examples. Eastman Kodak was the 6th level manager, and the Ministry of Public Works in Mexico, from which I just came, was the 3rd level manager who introduced the change. It succeeded, and so it spread throughout the rest of the company. So what it takes is somebody that's either excited by the idea and has the guts, the courage to do it, or a state of crisis. Those are the two things we're bringing about.
What does it take to get a business school to recognize that and start teaching synthesis instead of analysis?
What will make the business schools realize, though?
No, they don't. I only know of one business school in the world which systematically does this, although I'm told there are others that have begun. The one I know about is in England, the University of Hull, where Michael Jackson, the dean, is one of the principal systems thinkers in the world, has recently published a marvelous book called Systems Thinking. They use all this in the teaching of business. We used to do this in the Wharton School, but as soon as I retired, they got rid of it because it threatened the school. We were doing everything unconventionally. We had no admission requirements, no examination, no courses, no curriculum. All we had was learning. And the university is not interested in learning, it's interested in teaching. But only in a certain way. You see, a university has nothing to do with education. That's a myth. If you attend faculty meetings, they never talk about education. It's clear that the purpose of a university is to provide the faculty with the quality of work life they want. Now, teaching is a price they have to pay to get it. Now, what happens with prices? You try to minimize them, right? So the faculty spends its time trying to minimize the amount of teaching it does. Now, you can see that easily. Take the universities in the United States and list them from the best to the worst. Take and start with Harvard and Stanford and Berkeley, for example, and get out into Kent State. How much teaching is done on the average by a professor at Harvard? Do you know? It's 3 to 5 hours a year. At Kent State, it's 30 hours a semester. You see, the worse the school is, the more teaching is done. The higher the rank of a professor, the less teaching they do. Teaching is a price you pay. Furthermore, it turns out the teacher is the major obstruction to learning. Universities are obstructions to learning. Now, a very easy way to show this. How many of you ever taught a course? Anywhere, you taught a course. Lift your hands up so you get an idea. So a lot of you, right? Who learned the most in the course you taught? Clearly, the teacher. Schools are upside down. The best way to learn is to teach somebody else, not be taught. Students ought to be teaching. That's the way to learn. And what should the faculty be doing? What they know how to do, learning. In fact, let me tell you, can I tell my little story that just happened to me? I lectured to a group of undergraduate students recently by invitation, and when I was finished, I was walking down the hall, and a student came chasing me. He said, "Professor," and I turned around and said, "Yeah, what's up?" He said, "I just read your last book, Recreating the Corporation." This was a couple years ago. He said, "It's great. I really liked it. It contains a lot more than you know." Well, I had to reflect on that for a moment as to who the you was that he was referring to. We walked a couple extra steps and he said, "Do you mind if I ask you a personal question?" I said, "No, go ahead." He said, "How old are you?" Well, at the time I was young, I was only 86. So I told him, 86. "Wow," he said, "you're old." Well, I couldn't deny it, so we took a couple more steps. "When did you teach your first class?" he said. I said, "That I remember exactly. September of 1941. "Wow," he said. "You mean to say you've been teaching for more than 60 years? I said, "Yeah." A couple more steps, and then he asked a marvelous question. "When did you teach for the first time a course which did not exist when you were a student?" Isn't that a great question? I had to think, and I could identify it. It's when I moved from one university to Case. That was September of 1951. And I told him, "Wow," he said. "You mean to say that everything you've taught for more than 50 years, you never were taught?" You had to learn on your own. I said, right. He said, you must be a pretty good learner. I modestly agreed. What a shame, he said, you're not that good a teacher. He had it right. Faculty ought to be learning. That's what they know how to do. They don't know how to teach. The students ought to learn how to teach. Look, think back to the one-room schoolhouse, the old one, you know. Who taught? In a room that was filled with students of all ages, from 6 to 18, at all different levels of education. A teacher in that one-room classroom couldn't teach. What did she do and what did they do? They taught each other. And a teacher was there to assist them in that process. That's the concept. But how do we enlarge that to a large school? Well, it's been done. There are schools that have made the transformation, but not universities. Hull is the only one I know of that's done it. Okay? I'm sorry that was so long. We still have some time. You've got a question here. Just a minute. He'll give you the mic so the others can hear you.
What would be the first thing you would do if you could change the way the corporation operates today, where you have the management into workers in completely different cane? Now you can have all the lean systems, you can have everything, but unless you have what you have there, you will never reach the height we could.
Yeah. See, unfortunately, in 3 hours, I can't do a complete introduction to systems thinking. At the graduate level, it takes 14 3-hour sessions to cover an introduction. My book, The Redesign of the Corporation, covers the introductory course. So there's a lot I've left out. Your question points that out. Because you can't do all the things I've talked about without reorganizing and having a different concept of corporate organization. If I'd had time, I would show you that a corporation at one time was thought of as a machine that had been created by its owner to serve his purposes. That's very similar to the way we looked at the universe. The universe was a machine created by God to do his work. The original owner could do whatever he wanted to because there were no laws, no unions. He could do what the hell he wanted. And so a company was looked at as the universe, as a machine created by its God to do his work. Later on, it got looked at as an organism. That's when a company became a corporation. Corporation comes from the word corpus, a body. And that happened when public ownership began of corporations in order to generate the capital necessary for growth. That's a long history that I can't really take you through. But you can see it when we began to talk about the CEO as the head of the corporation. We're now looking at the corporation as a body. We talk about the health of the corporation. Stafford Beer wrote a book called The Brain of the Firm, and another one, The Heart of the Enterprise. The whole language of biology moved over. After World War II, for reasons which are discussed in the text, we went through another change when we began to look at a corporation as a social system. The social system has purposes of its own, like you do, but its parts have purposes of their own. Yours don't. Your heart and your lungs, your brain don't have purposes of their own. The social system, the parts do. Furthermore, the social system is a part of a larger system, has purposes of its own, and it contains other systems that have purposes of their own. So today we see a corporation as in a sea of purpose at different levels with incompatible purposes at each level, and this produces complexity with one of the major developments in science, the theory of complexity. How to deal with complex situations. Now, a marvelous English thinker by the name of Handy, Charles Handy, reflecting on these changes, has pointed out that we are beginning to look at a corporation as a community, not as a biological entity. Now, this is fascinating for several reasons. Who owns Los Angeles? Nobody. The concept of ownership is irrelevant in a community. The concept of stakeholder and membership is what is relevant. It's the first thing that happens. The second thing that happens is that you reflect on it. There are several things you want to get rid of. The first one is job descriptions. Why? Because job descriptions limit what people can do. It doesn't enlarge it. What you want to do is bring somebody in saying, here's where you're going to be. Look around, see what needs to be done, and do whatever you can do. And whatever needs to be done that you can't do, it's your responsibility to get somebody to do it. And you completely change the nature of the organization. We know from research, this is an incredible number, that only 23% of what employees know that's relevant to their job are they allowed to use. Imagine if we use any other resource that poorly. Only 1/4 of it. The other thing you got to get rid of is attaching salary to status. See, we have grading in corporations, and your salary is fixed by your grade. Now that's led to an absolutely ridiculous situation. In the United States, the average span of command of a manager is 3.5 people. In Japan, it's 8.4. And they're right, and we're wrong. We have 3 times as many managers per employee as the Japanese have. Why? Now this number will really shock you, because it shocked the hell out of me. 20% of the managers in the United States have only 1 person reporting to them. Ask yourself, why the devil would we create a manager with only 1 person reporting to them? You know why? You see, he works for me, and he's a grade 8. I'm a grade 9. I want to increase his salary. He's very good, but he's at the top of the salary of his grade. See, the only way I can increase your salary is to promote you. But if I promote you to a 9, you're now a manager. But I can increase your salary, and to justify the management, I assign 1 person to you, usually a secretary. It's stupid to fix salary to status. It ought to be fixed to the value of the contribution you make, regardless of where. Look, there's a salesman at General Electric in the lamp division who sold more than $40 million worth of lamp bulbs last year. He made more money than Jack Welch did. He deserved to. Company can do without Jack Welch a whole lot easier than they do without $40 million of sales. So when you start to look at a corporation as a community, you have to reevaluate a whole number of assumptions you make about the way to run a corporation. Okay? One of them I wish I had time to go into. Downsizing is not only immoral, it is ineffective. You can show that within 2 years, every company that downsizes will have increased costs, and we know why. Outsourcing may not be effective. It can be, but it may not be, and usually isn't. Total quality management programs fail 2/3 of the time. All those kind of statistics you can explain when you look at the corporation as a biological entity instead of a community. Okay?
To Dr. Ackoff, it's been a pleasure having you with us again today.
Pleasure being here.